So our final lecture of the week and final lecture of the semester talks about when domes attack. So this is really about how cities or municipalities are footing the bill for stadiums, arenas, for teams that are owned by billionaires and leagues that are making um, fortunes off of fans. But the cities are the ones that end up actually paying a good portion of these new arenas and these new stadiums that get put up. Now, the first element of or first aspect of the reading that we talk about is the New Orleans Saints, and that when Hurricane Katrina hit, Saints tickets were about $90 a pop. The Superdome, home of the Saints, was publicly funded in 1975. Minimum wage jobs and money continues to be thrown at the tourism industry. Never really sort of high-paying jobs or livable wages for those working the jobs in the tourism industry or around the Superdome or even in the Superdome working as cashiers, concessions, ticket takers, things like that. None of those are really enough to make a living off of. They're sort of seasonal work at best. And poverty continues to cripple large portions of the city. And before, during, and after Katrina, poverty has been a problem in New Orleans. The reading even sort of eerily mentions Houston as another example of a team or an organization that has built a shiny new stadium on the backs of the impoverished of the city. And this was actually before Hurricane Harvey hit devastated Houston. So it was sort of between Katrina and Harvey that the article was written. It's kind of in some way eerily forecasting kind of the devastation and destruction that was following Katrina in the form of Harvey. Sort of a similar pattern of sort of impoverished city funding or largely funding the stadiums and sort of having kind of this crippling poverty continue. And then a hurricane comes in and sort of wipes out all of these impoverished areas. Now, this isn't to say that Katrina or Harvey wouldn't have done the same sort of devastation or lives or finances or world sort of or shaken up, but perhaps it is to say that that money could have been better used elsewhere to better serve the citizens of the city. And I think that's a fair argument to make. In another section of the reading, they talk about the Minnesota Twins and the fans in the Twin Cities. For about 2 decades, there had been a referendum up on voting day on the ballot for a number of occasions, but they've all failed. Public referendums asking for public funding of a new ballpark. But it was finally forced through, kind of behind closed doors deal, politically based deal, not a public referendum, but it got forced through. And then tragically, on the week of the groundbreaking for Target Field, there was a sort of infamous fatal bridge collapsing within the city. So the city's infrastructure, which clearly needed more funding, was perhaps the result of lack of funding that was taken away due to perhaps some public fundings for Target Field or for similar types of public expenditures. Again, not saying that Target Field is to blame for a bridge collapsing, but perhaps that money could have been better spent elsewhere. And certainly the citizens of the Twin Cities voted that that money should be spent elsewhere for decades prior to Target Field actually getting its funding through sort of a kind of a backroom deal. And then the final example is the Washington Nationals, which got a $1 billion with a big B, $1 billion stadium built, and nearly all of it was paid by the citizens in the surrounding areas. And DC is one of the poorest cities in the Western Hemisphere. Other markets, just to kind of give you a gauge, other markets, the municipalities surrounding the stadium were paying about 30%, but that wasn't the case for the DC area. They paid a much larger percentage, and the sort of the tragedy, or one of the tragedies in this, is that those fans in that immediate surrounding area, the impoverished fans, aren't even really the ones that pay for the tickets or go to the games or able to pay for the tickets. It's largely attended by sort of wealthy white suburbians who drive into the games. So we might be thinking about this in terms of our own city here in Indianapolis. About 850,000 residents. Approximately 20% are at or below the poverty line, which is about 170,000 people. The city has a median income of about $50K, which isn't bad, but it's not great. At the time of its building, Lucas Oil cost about $720 million, and the Colts organization paid $100 million of that. So about $620 million got covered by taxes. And the Lucas Oil was built, of course, with the idea of revitalization of the downtown area, sports tourism, bringing in Super Bowls, which it has done, and other sorts of big business. But the tourism industry and bringing in sort of big sports, and there's always a talk about creating jobs and creating revenue as a sort of a selling point for it. But if you think about the sort of at or below poverty line individuals especially, the types of jobs that they would get in the tourism industry or the big sports industry would probably be ticket takers, parking attendants, concessions, maybe some sort of security level or security work. But it certainly isn't owner of downtown businesses or execs or VPs or anything like that within the sports industry. So it isn't creating those types of high-paying jobs when we're thinking about jobs that it creates. It's low-pay, often seasonal work that doesn't really add up to a ton of money or a ton of great value for the people that take on those jobs in and of themselves. So if they're coupled with maybe 3 or 4 other seasonal jobs, maybe it all adds up. But for just the one thing in and of itself, probably isn't that great of a payoff. So if those are the types of jobs that are being created, what's really the payoff in terms of those sort of at or below poverty line level whose taxes are being increased, and then even sort of the median income, $50,000 a year tax level, they're likely not to be getting sort of a lot of really high-paying jobs out of this sports venue that they're paying as a city a lot of money for. So that brings us to our fifth and final discussion item. If you ask the average sports fan about the rationality of cities footing the bill for billionaire sports owners, what do you think they would say? What do you think they think about it? Do they think it's worth it? Do they think it's a crime, but what are you going to do? Talk about that for a little bit. And then if you ask citizens who are at or below the poverty line if they should have an increase in taxes to pay for a new stadium, talk about what they might think or what they might say. Maybe they're in the same boat as sort of the average fan. Maybe it's sort of a worthwhile distraction, but maybe it's not. So just think about those elements and talk about that in your discussion post. And that wraps up your discussion post for the week. And this wraps up your lectures for the week. So once you are all clear of your final discussion item, you're all set for the week in terms of your discussion post.